What's the deal, everybody? Welcome back to the studio. Jeremy Deal here, and today we're going to be going over real estate lens selections. I'm going to be telling you my favorite lens for the Sony full frame system doing real estate photos, and I'll tell you why I chose it over its more expensive counterpart. Let's go. All right, everybody, not to bury the lead or anything, but today we are going to be talking about the Sony 12-24 f4G lens for the full frame Sony system. This is actually the lens I picked. Now, its more expensive counterpart is the G Master. The difference in these two lenses is really not only the weight associated, but the G Master does a 2.8 and this lower version only does f4. So there's a big difference. Now, if you're doing mainly video with your Sony camera, there would be a reason to get the G Master over the G lens. That f2.8 will really help in certain scenarios, but when it comes down to real estate video and real estate photos in particular, I never really envisioned myself going below that f4 marking because, you know, with real estate video, you're trying to keep everything in focus, and same with photos. You want as much in focus as possible, so dropping down to that low f-stop is never really recommended unless, of course, you're on a micro four thirds system like I was before. My GH5S can handle, you know, f3.2 and everything is still in focus perfectly, but something more full frame with the larger sensor has a shallower depth of field, so something like an f3.2 on my Sony full frame compared to the micro four thirds, there will be way less in focus than on the micro four thirds system. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, its bigger brother counterpart that I'm talking about, the G Master, it is also way more expensive. Let's talk about the price difference. This f4 version G lens, according to the Sony website right now, is $1,799, $1,799 US dollars, while the G Master variant of this lens is $2,999. Way more expensive. $1,300 almost more expensive.
That's a lot of money.
Just for that shallower depth of field. Now, if you're doing a lot of portraits with your lens, maybe you should consider once again that G Master, but if you're doing a portraits lens, there's probably a better selection than that. This review is really just kind of going over real estate photos in particular, because that is the system I switched from micro four thirds photo and real estate to full frame A7 IV for real estate. Now, let's go over why you would pick this over some of its counterparts, like maybe a Sigma or a Tamron or a Rokinon or any of those other third-party manufacturers that make lens for the system. The number one thing that I'm going to talk about is the AF/MF or the autofocus manual focus switch right on the lens. It's very helpful to have something like this just right there on the lens, because even though the A7 IV that I switched to has a ton of customizable buttons, who wants to dedicate a button somewhere on the camera to something that is already on a lens? So that's the number one reason why I would choose it maybe over one of the other counterparts, is having that right there. And the other reason why is there's a button on the Sony lens which gives you just one more button to program, especially with the A7 IV, because basically everything is programmable. So what I actually have mine set to is a focus lock. So that way, whenever I press that button right there on the side of the lens, my focus is locked on that position. And this is really good when you're handheld shooting, not so much on gimbal or slider, but really when you're doing that handheld, it's really nice. I use it in particular sometimes when I'm using the 1080-120 on the Sony A7 IV. Now, on that same line, since we're talking about these third-party lenses, let's go with another reason you may select the Sony, and that is because the autofocus. The autofocus on this lens is very quiet in comparison to some of the third-party lenses I've chose that kind of sound like there's a bit of sand in there, or it moves very fast and jerky. The Sony autofocus system is very smooth, so therefore it's very quiet, and I've just noticed that as something over time of using the actual Sony brand camera lenses. And just a little reminder, I'm actually shooting this video right now on the 12-24. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about for the photo and video side compared and its overview advantages is the sharpness. This thing is really, really sharp, and that is a huge advantage when doing real estate photo and videos, because you want everything to be as tack sharp as possible. Whenever you use autofocus, it locks on quickly and reliably. I have tried a Rokinon product that was very similar to this, and it always seemed to miss focus just a tiny bit, and that became very annoying to me. So this lens, I've actually never had that problem, knock on wood right here, because I don't want it to have that problem, but that's just another overview advantage of this lens. So now let's get into maybe some of these disadvantages. Now, the biggest disadvantage with this lens, in my opinion, especially when it comes to real estate photo and videos, is that it's too wide and bulbous on the front to have a thread filter size. This is really annoying because polarizers, I don't want to say they're mandatory, but they are super useful and effective in real estate video, and not being able to apply one directly to the lens is a huge disadvantage. If you have seen any of my other videos, you will know that I had to go out and purchase a third-party system. It's called the WonderPana polarizer system, and it's meant for wide-angle lenses, in particular with no thread systems. It has a 176 millimeter thread or something like that. I don't remember the exact millimeter off the top of my head, but it is huge. Now, the disadvantage to this is that you can't put it directly on the lens itself, but the advantage is that having an oversized filter allows you to use it for multiple lens systems. So that's one advantage and disadvantage wrapped into one, but I would consider it overall a major disadvantage, especially when you're trying to reduce the size of gear that you bring out every day. This WonderPana system is huge on my camera, and it makes it very difficult for me to easily transport. I had it in a Pelican case for a while, but even that was a tiny bit too narrow. I was afraid I was going to, crack that front polarizer by putting too much pressure on the case while trying to close it all up. So I had to rearrange my Peak Designs bag, and that's what I'm using now. But that is one big disadvantage to this lens. The other big disadvantage, which isn't really a disadvantage, but you'll see a lot of people shoot with the Sony or the off-brand Sony 16-24 or 16-35, whatever it is. I can't remember off the top of my head. Now, what I like about this lens is also a disadvantage, that it's actually a little too wide for real estate photos. If you crank this thing open to 12, it is showing everything, and it has a little bit of barrel distortion going on, and I personally think it's a little too wide. I personally believe the perfect sweet spot is 14 millimeters, if you've heard me talk about it in my videos previous to this. So that is where I traditionally shoot with this lens. So I can't ever really crank it wide open, but you can turn this disadvantage into an advantage, because it's not really too much of a problem to be able to go too wide, especially whenever you're getting in these very tiny bathrooms. One day the MLS will stop updating the number of images and instead allow us to inlay vertical and horizontal images instead of just horizontal like they are now. But keep that in mind when you're shooting these MLS photo shoots, is that the MLS only allocates horizontal images. If you give them a vertical image, they will transform it into a horizontal image, and it looks horrible. So having these extra 2 millimeters of wideness when I reach these small little half baths has been useful. So I don't really know if that was a disadvantage or if I should have thrown it up in the advantages category. Now just remember, if you're liking all this information and you're finding it useful, press like, mash subscribe, all that jazz. Back into it. Let's go straight into talking about the very last thing I'm going to bring up. And it's, in my opinion, the best feature of this lens with this camera. Now this camera, as I said before, has a bunch of customizable function buttons and regular buttons. The most useful thing I have found about this lens with the A7 IV is that crop in button, which effectively turns this lens not only a 12-24, but you can press that crop and then it turns more into like a 24-48, thus doubling the focal distance of this lens, which can be really useful on site. It's really nice to no longer have to zoom in and out and catch focus. What's nice about this is you can catch focus, snap a button, and then for your tight shot, press that crop button on the back. It brings it into a 35 mil crop. It takes that focal distance and essentially doubles it. So instead of having to zoom in, you can take whatever your current focal distance is, which, as I mentioned earlier, for me is usually 14, press that cropped in button on the back, and now all of a sudden it's a 28. That's really useful for doing that wide shot and then cropping into the more architectural style, just two. Or maybe you want to focus in on just the fireplace. It makes it way easier. You can now take a bunch of different variants using this lens everywhere from 12 to 48, whatever your heart desires. And that is actually my number one reason why I love this lens and the A7 IV together. Now, granted, you can also do that with the 2.8, and if you have the money, obviously go after the 2.8. It's a little bit heavier than this lens, so if you are a gimbal shooter, that may be something to consider. Another reason why I chose this lens, because it's lighter and way easier to use on my gimbal and balancing out throughout the whole process. That's it, everybody. That is why I chose the 12 to 24 4G lens instead of the 2.8 G Master. Hope that information was useful. As always, keep rocking and rolling. Enjoy what you're doing. Make smart business decisions. And if you haven't checked out this lens, maybe you should. Catch you next time. Real Estate Photography 101.